Call of Duty and Battlefield are broken, scattered, hunted, defeated by me. I wish I could tell you it was difficult, but it wasn't.
I don't think the critics have done a good job with Halo Infinite so far. I've yet to see a review to truly capture the feeling of this game. What did you think I meant by that title? I think it's going to take time to properly evaluate this game, but I think it's good. I know my cynical outlook and criticism of 343 have made some in the audience expect me to tear it apart, but I just can't. I really enjoyed Halo Infinite. That's not to say it doesn't have some undeniable flaws, but Halo Infinite's campaign is fantastic. I do really find the criticisms levied at Halo Infinite to be quite interesting. I find many of the criticisms odd. I don't want to say that somebody's preferences are wrong, that people aren't entitled to their own taste or lack of taste regarding games. Far from it. People are entitled to their proclivities. But I do want to use the critics as a springboard to my points on this game. I'm using them as a catalyst to present my own critiques. One interesting thing I've found about almost all of the Halo Infinite reviews is that there is no consensus. Nobody can seem to agree on it at all. Many people are saying wildly conflicted things. That's not to say they have to agree. I'm always suspect when there's a complete consensus on a game. But for Halo Infinite, it seems as though everybody played a different game entirely. They had personalized copies. I'm going to be evaluating the critical reception of Halo Infinite and its place among the pantheon of open world games, just as much as I'm going to critique the game on its own merits. I watched the reviews before playing. They released a day before I got to play myself, so they kind of clouded my judgment. Of course, they were significantly positive, but there were many caveats. I was actually concerned by these. After all, Halo 4 and Halo 5 both scored very well as well. I'm not a fan of 343's prior output, and I'm no stranger to criticizing them. I'm not biased towards 343 when I praise Infinite. I only played through Halo 5 once. I immediately started a new playthrough of Infinite after I completed it the first time. So when I heard these things about the campaign, I was rightfully concerned.
It just kind of feels very half-assed.
While there's nothing that feels wholly original here relative to games like Far Cry or Just Cause,
the open world adds absolutely nothing to the game at all. It's not as bad as a Ubisoft open world game, but it's not much better either. The open world is big, but it's also pretty empty.
It took a really long time to get through this segment, and by that point I was kind of over the open world stuff, so to be pushed into it in such a deliberate way for such a long time, I didn't love that.
Now, I guess I gotta go straight into the juicy part. That's how I like doing this. I think Halo Infinite's open world is magnificent. If I had to summarize why, briefly, I'd say that it has as few of the things that I hate about open world games as possible. I want you, the viewer, to ask yourself, if you've played Infinite, on your first playthrough, did you know there was a fast travel? How many times did you use the fast travel? Same thing with soft kill barriers. How many times did you see these things in the game? Speaking from my own experience, very little. I can easily imagine going the whole game not knowing they exist. That is already a good sign. It is really hard to summarize just why I love Halo Infinite's open world so much. I do really enjoy the scale. It isn't actually the biggest map in terms of square feet, but its incredibly high peaks make the world feel huge. This is especially important in a game like Halo. Navigating Halo Infinite's open world is an absolute joy. It's meant to have a world that sparks wonder. It's meant to win you over with its sci-fi grandeur. And it does, for me. It has these high peaks and low troughs. Halo Infinite's open world is great at empowering you. To truly feel powerful in a game, your achievements need to reflect your player expression. You need to feel deprived and weak before you can feel powerful. I feel that Saints Row 4 fell into this trap. The superpowers it gives you were fun at first. You had such a command over the world, but by the end it was just kind of boring to navigate. It had trivialized the world. There was no point in this whole vehicle system they had. You were the sovereign of the world. But it wasn't a position you earned. It was given to you by heredity rather than won. Halo Infinite does give you the grapple hook. It's certainly empowering and could lead to the same trap, but doesn't quite cause the same issues. For one, it requires skill. You can chain multiple grapples together like Spider-Man and go for that super boost. but only on rare moments where everything lines up perfectly. And it feels rewarding when you can do these moves to actually help you navigate. And another point, the grapple isn't the fastest way to navigate. Vehicles are faster, and each vehicle has a unique role. And actually, where do these vehicles even come from? The mongoose, formerly the butt of every joke, has been empowered with a speed boost. Every vehicle provides a unique offering. The Banshee, useless in multiplayer, feels amazing in campaign. Its weapons aren't even that good, but just gives you so much power in navigation. This mission, remarked as tedious by some.
Similarly, there's a mission at the back end of the game which drops you on an entirely new chunk of Zeta Halo, and you need to reach the four corners of it. And parts of it are blocked off by banished checkpoints, and there are plenty of fobs that you should probably capture while you're there. It took a really long time to get through this segment, and by that point I was kind of over the open world stuff, so to be pushed into it in such a deliberate way for such a long time, I didn't love that.
This mission is when the world clicked for me. Like 343 took a crowbar to my brain and hotwired me into another 343 drone. Grabbing that Banshee felt like a revelation. All the freedom just came rushing in a moment. It's good because a Banshee feels like something you earned. There's skill expression. It's also temporary. It's not like the world becomes permanently easier to explore from here on out. By disempowering you most of the time, it makes you feel all the more powerful when you unlock the freedom afforded by the Banshee. It feels good, like when you beat that bitch-made elite to his own ride on Assault on the Control Room. You become an empowered and liberated woman. While it did make me feel smart, I realized that people who didn't grab the Banshee to complete these objectives wouldn't have had the same experience. I can see how they'd be frustrated by this mission. Halo isn't prescriptive about how to play. It strongly hints for you to get the Banshee, and a good Halo fan knows it's rude to turn down such a gracious offer. But such axioms as always steal a vehicle aren't as obvious to non-Halo fans. This feeling of power you derive from player expression is similar to Morrowind, particularly those Telvanni mushroom towers. In the story, the Telvanni are prejudiced against non-magic people, so the only way to navigate in these towers is by learning the levitation spell. Like stealing the Banshee, it's a little avenue for you to exert your own mastery over the world that doesn't directly force you into it. It lets you figure it out and makes you feel smarter for doing so. Or it does strongly hint, almost outright tell you what the solution is. The world is like a puzzle. You're meant to figure out where to go.
Navigating the map's also incredibly confusing because of how rocky and mountainous the terrain is. I mean, you might only be trying to go somewhere that's a few hundred meters away, but because it's on the other side of a giant mountain or hidden behind a bunch of trees, it's really unclear as to how the fuck you're supposed to get there.
The rocky and mountainous terrain is the whole point of the world. It shouldn't be easy to navigate. I guess the fundamental issue is that people have differing ideologies regarding what an open world should be. To me, navigating the open world is the whole point of having an open world. Why have an open world if you're just going to be driving on a straight line to your objective? And it's not like it was that hard to navigate. The map shows you all those roads anyway. You can just get out and grapple your way there if you're that impatient. You have the choice.
It just kind of feels very half-assed, and if you're used to all of the quality of life inclusions that most open world games have these days, well, then this is just going to feel very stripped back.
And what do you mean by these quality of life features? Do you mean like navigation arrows or lines from GTA? Those are quality of life features in the same way sprinting is. They're not. They affect the gameplay, they alter the player experience, and I think in this case would diminish the world. If anything, there should be less hand-holding. No beams of light telling you exactly where to go. Let the players figure it out. That's kind of the open world ideology of Death Stranding. The navigation is the gameplay in that game. Of course, Halo Infinite is nowhere near as deep in terms of movement mechanics, and it certainly doesn't strip you down in terms of your player abilities quite so much. Skyrim is another game with a focus on conquering the environment through navigation. Halo Infinite is similar to Death Stranding in terms of its terrain. It has a natural style of terrain, and it makes the terrain itself the obstacle. I wouldn't be surprised if 343 were indoctrinated into Strand-type thinking during the course of development. Now we're just holding out for that Monster Energy crossover. Okay. One flaw with Death Stranding is that the navigation is a challenge, but everything else is just kinda boring. Actually no, everything else is really boring. The rewards don't feel meaningful and the combat is god awful. What Halo Infinite does is, well, gives you freedom to explore in wide open spaces, but then it funnels you into enclosed spaces, where you fight the enemies on their terms. In this way, Halo Infinite takes after Halo Combat Evolved. Basically, the end goal of your traversal is to arrive at another meaningful, well-designed, and well-thought-out encounter. The combat encounters in the world are meaningful. That is, I feel, another point towards Halo when you compare it to, say, Rockstar open worlds. Rockstar is held up universally as the gold standard for open world design. They're incredibly detailed with a ton of systems. But, this is going to be controversial, I feel those worlds are kinda shallow. Horseballs can only excite you for so long. There are many systems, but they are all just kind of surface level demos. And the systems aren't really connected to one another. Grand Theft Auto 5 had the stock market system, for example. Cool, so the stock market changes dynamically depending on your actions and choices in the world? Not really. There are a couple of missions where certain stocks will increase in value at set points, but it's an easy illusion to see through. It's basically just a free cash reward for people on their second playthrough, who know what to invest in. To explain why I'm bringing up Rockstar games, I'm doing a comparison with different open world games to figure out Halo Infinite's position in the open world pantheon, also known as the Legion of time-wasting garbage. Another example is the combat. Another example in Rockstar games is the combat. It has the depth of a paddle pool that's just been pissed in by the spoiled kid with rich parents. Part of the reason you go around the world is to get money for new toys to use in combat. The combat is much of the actual content that fills the world. In Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, the combat sucks. It's always sucked, really. It is the most mindless shooting imaginable. The enemies won't challenge you in any interesting ways. They do not provide any opportunities to utilize interesting strategies and actually, play around with a sandbox. In a sandbox game, everyone remembers the first time they got in a huge police chase. It felt good because it was an expression of player agency. You made all this mayhem, but you quickly realize every single chase is the same, and it will always end with the same result. It's good as a system to facilitate more interesting missions. But here's the thing, most of the actual police chases in story missions, with a meaning, actual purpose, and an objective, are scripted anyway. It'd be cool if they were part of the regular police wanted level, but Rockstar want their stories to be scripted Hollywood action. They're incredibly prescriptive regarding how you play, which clashes with the whole point of an open world. At least in the past, there was more freedom with open mission structures. The games are well written, but not fun worlds to play in. There is a disconnect between what Rockstar want and the games they actually make. Red Dead 2 has these massive mountain ranges. They have this incredible scale, but it's not a fun puzzle to navigate these mountains. You climb them on a very set path. I point this out because Halo Infinite's open world and combat gameplay are in harmony. The combat encounters feel like a part of the world. You can organically come across encounters without a loading screen, without some quest vendor telling you to do it.
This open world is pretty big, but there's not a lot to do in it.
It just would have been cool if Halo Infinite's open world leaned a bit into a more Skyrim-like experience.
Zeta Halo is a very uninteresting place to explore, even though it's a very fun place to mess shit up as Master Chief.
I actually like that the game doesn't have many of these open world features. The world exists to support the main story. While the map is one connected open world, I think of each chunk as a mission unto its own. I like the fact that the game does not focus on these extraneous details, although I do still find them fun.
The objectives are very generic, but the process for completing those objectives is always so damn fun.
The concept of liberating a base might seem played out, but design-wise, Halo Infinite's objectives are incredible. This is most comparative with Batman Arkham Asylum or Metro Exodus. Batman had a small list of people with info on Hillary Clinton to take out. Metro had a few bases to clear and collectibles to pick up, like grabbing a teddy bear so that you don't get the ending where you're damned to hell for all eternity. Infinite feels like a classic Halo campaign, in that you can play through each mission one after the other without having to spend time unlocking new equipment. You never need to fast travel. It's an open world without the flame retardant, kid-safe, environmentally dubious stuffing. You do get to do some stuff for fun, but it's all optional, just for a few extra toys to play with. It never forces you into it. Some may ask then, what's the point of an open world if it doesn't have these things? Well, like I said, It's the act of navigation that feels good. Plus it serves the artistic story and thematic purpose of inspiring a sense of wonder. Now for a moment of speculation. Apparently, Joe Staten made a couple of changes to the campaign, mainly to make it more like classic Halo, where you weren't forced into side objectives, but rather able to continue from one mission directly to the next. Apparently a massive chunk of the game was cut. I actually think this supposed editorializing is a good thing. We don't know how good this potential content was. I'd rather a campaign with all killer and no filler. How about Far Cry?
But what you get instead here is an open world structure that feels pretty static and I'd say more akin to a Ubisoft open world game. You're essentially following markers on a map so that more markers can be revealed.
It's not as bad as a Ubisoft open world game, but it's not much better.
The game is nothing like Far Cry. It's only similar in the most superficial elements, like it's open world, it has outposts, it's an FPS. The navigation is different. In Far Cry, the navigation isn't really much of a challenge. There is a mass of fast travel points dotted all over the map. Most objectives will be pretty easy to get to. The Far Cry ideology tends to see the open world as a chore, something to be avoided. It's only there to host an industrial sewer tank's worth of content. Said content is likely similar in quality to the contents of said sewer tank. They reward you capturing a base by giving you fast travel. Your reward is literally being able to skip parts of the game. Of course, most games have this feature. Halo Infinite has it, but that's because it's obligatory. Fast travel is helpful for completionists looking for every McDonald's toy strewn about the map, but in Halo Infinite, the average player can go the whole campaign without using it. You know how I spoke about those extraneous objectives? Well, that's like 85% of Far Cry, and you have to grind out these outposts. Halo Infinite has outposts. They are designed infinitely better. They all have different objectives and lore purpose. Okay, that's been done before, but as well as that, they're far better spaces to fight in. Like classic Halo, you have these wide open spaces, but then you're funneled into tightly designed arenas with cover, where enemies can rush, flank, outmaneuver, and generally slap you around much more easily. It is more challenging to take the path of least resistance when you know you've got an objective inside a building guarded by a hammer brute. Most Far Cry bases are way too open. You have all these tools, but they're of little use compared to the most efficient and easy method. Not to mention, the combat is so much more shallow. Again, only human enemies with similar health pools and movement. You can sit back and snipe in Halo Infinite, but it's not the most efficient or fun playstyle, and plenty of enemies will frustrate your attempts. Of course, I can't compare this game to every single open world. I haven't played Zelda Breath of the Wild. I don't own a Switch. That's because I'm not a man-child. That's because I haven't gotten around to it yet. I've already got an unholy backlog that, to sort through, would make any giddy accountant simply burst in excitement. Perhaps Breath of the Wild is the missing link for me in this whole understanding open worlds thing. One thing that's very important to note for the open world discussion is the distinction between design and visuals.
And it doesn't have biomes that separate it. It doesn't have unique architectural featuring since all the structures are built using the same assets. It doesn't have internal spaces like vast cave networks.
Now, one compromise resulting from the open world structure is a lessened level of environmental variety compared to past Halo games. Because past entries were separated by levels, you could really take Master Chief across all kinds of different environments, whereas with Halo Infinite, you're kind of stuck with Zeta Halo, which isn't the most environmentally varied of open world.
Halo Infinite did receive criticism for a repetitive open world. Design-wise, this is false. Each area of the map is very different in terms of the terrain, the geometry, the missions, and the encounters, but they do all look the same. Still an issue, but it's an important distinction that I think very few people make. So I kept on bringing up that combat when I was talking about the open world. This is one area that I felt has seen almost unilateral praise. Well, yeah, it's good. You likely already have an idea. There are a broad range of unique enemies with different methods that are effective against them. Shielded enemies take more plasma damage, unshielded enemies take precision damage. There are more damage types than ever, with a Forerunner hardlight that disintegrates enemies and shock damage that stuns them and disables vehicles. The fusion coils laying around are incredibly fun to play around with. There are so many chain explosions going off everywhere. The cause and effect from these delayed explosions was good for satisfying player needs. You get a sense of autonomy from observing the effect of your actions. You see that you did this. You get a feeling of control over your own player and over the battlefield. I'm not a fan of these ammo crates. I think you should have limited ammo to force you to swap out your weapons more often and use different weapons. Getting free refills like it's Subway doesn't exactly promote trying new things out. At least they don't apply to power weapons, mostly, and each weapon is unique and useful enough that you'll want to switch them out off your own prerogative. One line I heard constantly was that this is just another Halo game.
And after having spent about 14 hours with the campaign, I can indeed confirm that this is a Halo game through and through. Whether or not I'm entirely in love with it though, I'm still not sure, but people who want to put themselves back into Master Chief's iconic boots, with gameplay that feels about as old as he does, are going to find a lot to like about this latest entry.
You know, I'm glad G-Man admitted his lack of taste, lack of a connection with Halo in the video. You can tell he doesn't really like it. It's not a masterpiece like Doom Eternal or Fallout 76. But this, it's just more Halo thing is one of the most dismissive and more importantly, useless phrases. I mean, most of G-Man's reviews are the exact same game from 30 years ago with a new coat of paint. It can and has been applied to basically any sequel ever. People said it's just another Halo about every Halo sequel, including Halo 4 and 5, especially 5, which plays so differently to the other Halos besides the most superficial aspects. You don't have to be a Halo fan and do a deep dive on every mechanic. Even a surface level willingness to engage will reveal how stupid this dismissive phrase is. Halo Infinite has the biggest revamp of weapons of any Halo game. It has the fewest returning and most original weapons. I can't think of many other shooter sequels that have this much of an overhaul of the weapon system. Certainly not, say, Doom Eternal, which compared to Infinite only slightly changes the weapons from 2016. Halo Infinite has the most weapons of any FPS. Wait, how can that be right? There are games with hundreds of guns, but here's the thing, those games have many redundant weapons. In Call of Duty or Payday 2, you have like 20 different assault rifles that are almost identical. In Halo Infinite, each of the 22 weapons has a unique function. Some are similar, but not the same, they're all different. People can't decide which weapons are good and which suck. The Bulldog is great. It has both increased range and fire rate and ammo. Anyone saying the Mangler is bad needs to get good. It's only really fair to complain about the Ravager and Plasma Pistol, maybe the Hydra. Everything else, well, I'd call that a skill issue. I also got to mention that the grapple hook significantly changes the combat as well. You can fly around the map at any time. It opens up so many levels of elevation, but also can make it so easy to circumvent cover. And I can imagine they really would have needed to do a lot to actually account for that. Assassinations are now absent in single player. They were one of the most notable aspects of Halo's combat, especially on harder difficulties. They gave you an incentive to get up close to enemies and use melee. Movement, melee, and weapons are three of the most significant ways the player interacts with the game in an FPS, and they've all changed quite dramatically in Halo Infinite. If all these changes aren't enough for you, then what do you expect? Like, do you just want it to not be Halo? I think a lot of these critics don't even know what they want. I think it's worth mentioning that many reviews can't decide whether this is a game that railroads you into one path or playstyle, or one that gives you a ton of player freedom. Too much even. It's like people were playing their own customized copies.
It just kind of forces you to constantly switch out weapons and change your strategy, and that's definitely a part of what makes the game so much fun when it does click. People always say that Halo is a combat sandbox, and I think the difference with these games is that it's the player who has to adapt to the AI, versus the AI adapting to the player.
Infinite's move to an open world facilitates the sandbox and removes nearly all traces of developer dictation.
Everything just feels so tight and fair, and even on normal difficulty, it can really push you to play hard and use all of the weapons and equipment at your disposal.
This kind of freedom to fight how you want has always been a foundational component of Halo's gameplay. Infinite recaptures that signature freeform action in a big, fun way.
People can't decide. One thing I will concede has remained similar to the rest of the series is the enemies. There is more variety within the ranks than ever before, like the skimmers, but the returning enemies, which is most of them, fill similar roles as they did before. I do like how they made the elites and brutes stand side by side on the battlefield with slightly different roles. This is the best the brutes have ever been. Halo Infinite has done some competitor analysis. There's a little pinch of Doom Eternal in there, like they extracted the sweat of some balding 35-year-old with at least 35 different FPS games with 2D sprites in his Steam library and mixed that into a big ol' Halo pie. The Berserker and the Hunters seem to be more of a harder skill check, like the Marauder. The Berserkers rush you, throw grenades, and attack for massive damage. It's like they took the brute berserking from Halo 2 and extrapolated that into an enemy class all of its own. The Hunters are also juiced up majorly. They're quick. If you want to get around and shoot their back, you gotta be really fast. I don't actually know what to think of these guys yet. Many people have had a frustrating experience with these guys. Like, they're bullet spongy, but I have a feeling that people will, over time, figure out some pretty clever ways to take these dudes down. And the bosses are great. There are definitely strategies to take down these dudes way quicker, like, for example, try not to stand right in front of a melee enemy. And I saw people talk about how they cheesed these dudes on more than one occasion. It wasn't just G-Man this time. This isn't cheesing. This isn't some broken strat that you've discovered. You can't cheese Halo. Well, you can, but this isn't it. Most of these alternative strategies, like using the Warthog turret here, are accounted for in design. Part of the illusion of Halo is this idea that you're breaking the rules when you're really doing something that the developer intended, like getting your hog across the gap on Savo Highway. You feel like the ultimate hacker when you throw down a grav lift, but really, if the developers didn't want you taking a Warthog into the next area, they would have just put an invisible wall there. Finally, a big concern regarding design, the Forerunner levels. They were serious about their homage to Halo Combat Evolved. This goes back to the same point. Yes, they're visually repetitive, but the actual arenas are quite good. They have a lot of vertical freedom, something the Halos have always had.
There's rarely any kind of verticality to these arenas. You've got that grappling shot, but really that thing's only used laterally. You don't really get the chance to get above enemies all that often inside these areas. They break the mold a couple of times, giving you some jump pads, but the vast majority of combat takes place on the same level as the player, or shooting at someone slightly above or below you. And look, I understand that that's the way that most of the Halo games have been since the series' inception, but that's kind of my whole point. Here we are 20 years later and you may as well just be playing Combat Evolved with a better looking engine and a couple of new tricks. And look, I understand that that's the way that most of the Halo games have been since the series' inception.
The power cells aren't too bad as an objective. You can throw them, they're pretty easy to move. If you don't like these, you'd hate Payday 2. The worst thing about them is the wasted opportunity. They could have been used for some cool puzzles, but they're mostly mindless, just follow the objective. There is this one cool moment where you're rewarded with a weapon cache for taking this power seed across the gondola, but they don't really expand on this at all. The actual worst thing about these levels is that for much of them, you're only fighting these basic sentinels. They don't even have more interesting variants like enforcers or guardians. By the way, why do sentinels use shock rifles? So yeah, reviewers haven't properly distinguished visuals and design, but they do have a point when complaining about the visuals. They look good, the texture detail is incredible, the lush forests and the sheer scale of the world is magnificent. The Forerunner architecture is awe-inspiring, the Banished are shaping up to be a good replacement to the Covenant. They're less organic, more straight lines and jagged edges. They're more phallic. And they're red, which means they're evil. The colors are bright and distinct, while still showing good restraint. They have brought Halo's visual style back, but the critics are right. There are 3 locations: Banished, Forerunner, and Seattle. It does get visually samey over a longer period of time. I also don't want to go without mentioning the UNSC style. It's back to the classic style, which I'm not complaining about. I think there's another bit of Doom inspiration in Master Chief's design. He has these more heroic proportions, like a Greek god, like Doom Guy. He's got juicy biceps, like a big green ziz. It's also comparable to new God of War and Kratos, who is similarly sized, and who 343 admitted to taking inspiration from. Speaking of God of War inspiration, the story. I'm going to be talking about spoilers here. Go to the timestamp on screen if you haven't played yet and you want to avoid these spoilers. New Cortana's relationship with Chief is obviously inspired by the trend of father-child stories in games. I think they pulled it off. I actually really enjoyed the story. Clone Tana is characterized as incredibly naive, despite being a brain scan of an elderly scientist. She has immature and rash reactions to the events of the story, but slowly gains an understanding of the Master Chief and how he operates over the course of the game. It's an interesting scenario. The fate of all humanity rests on the shoulders of a fundamentally broken man, a 7-foot virgin who's in love with a VTuber. His only friend is this AI that was a copy of his mother figure. The Master Chief was built for one purpose. Everything is about the mission to Chief. It's quite fitting that every character is literally just a noun, an accessory to his mission. The weapon, the pilot. The greatest moment of character growth was when Chief simply learns their names. Whereas in previous Halos, you dealt with battle-worn heroes who knew what they were doing, giving orders. The crew of Halo Infinite is small and very inexperienced. The biggest part of their battle is actually just figuring out the Chief, like their life depends on it. One could even see it as an allegory for finding faith. You speak to him and yet hear no answers back. He has this seeming refusal to communicate with you, an inability. Sometimes it seems like he's not even there, but merely trust in him, and you shall fear no evil. The pilot especially is a story arc about faith. I do like the crew's chemistry. The weapons banter is decently humorous. I like that she thinks I smell good. But to be honest, I kinda wanna know how she smells. Although, in a rare G-Man W, I do think he has a point about the Marvel quips. It's fine from Clone Tana, but from the Marines, from the grunts, the bosses, the propaganda tower, the enemies do not shut up. 343 seems to have included a subtle meta-narrative. The weapons questions, "Can you trust me?" seem to reveal the thoughts of the people over at 343 toward the player base. Cortana's apology is like 343's apology to the fans. Killing off evil Cortana and starting with a blank slate seems to indicate a desire to start anew on good footing and asking the fans' permission to continue with this. There's also something to be said about how convoluted the story is. It's not actually that hard. I just think there's a lot that can lead you astray. The main characters are brand new. We didn't know anything about the Endless beforehand. You don't need to play Halo Wars 2 to understand it. To understand the story, you really only need to know bad aliens hate and want to kill humans, and then these aliens fought an uprising against those aliens. They still hate humans though. You fight over a ring because it's an ancient alien object full of ancient alien technology. That's it. I actually really like the main villain as well. He's certainly never going to outwit Master Chief, but he has a Saturday morning cartoon appeal to him. He has just enough charisma alongside a good performance to make him at least a decent villain. A lot of the Cortana stuff is merely tying up loose ends, and the Endless stuff, well, that's a part of the live service. Find out next year in the next episode of Halo Infinite. It's meant to be like those Marvel teasers. How I feel about that just depends on how they carry on the story, whether they do it with grace or completely fall flat. Finally, and most importantly, the music. I already touched on this before. I thought the music would be well suited to the open world. I was right. Hearing the classic Halo theme when you reach a high point is such an incredible moment. It hits all the areas I want it to. It could get me hyped on the road. It could make me feel for the characters. There is far more content in the soundtrack when compared with previous Halos, so it does have a slightly worse filler to killer ratio, but it still has just about as many great moments as a typical Halo soundtrack, that being a lot. And G-Man, stop posting your owls.
The music wasn't particularly memorable either.
It is very interesting to note that despite using many themes from the classic Halo games, they don't credit the people who wrote them. That's odd. In Star Wars Rogue One, they credit John Williams for writing the Star Wars theme, even though he didn't actually score the movie. I think composers are entitled to credit for things they, well, compose. It's clear to me that Halo Infinite will be subject to a shifting perception in the coming months. I think it's a good sign for a game to have come out and be hard to critically pin down. That the critics disagree so much. It shows that the game, with its faults, is original. It can't be nailed down so easily. Maybe, in time, I'll turn to hating it. Maybe I'm wrong about this. but I get a feeling that I'm not. I hope my loyal acolytes in the nerd army can truly promote the gospel of Halo Infinite good. Thanks for watching, subscribe, goodbye.
You got it. I'll be waiting for the call. Try not to die. You hear me?